In the heart of a bustling college town, nestled between the quaint coffee shops and overpriced bookstores, stood the old Whitmore residence, a Victorian-style house converted into student apartments. Its brick facade was draped in ivy, and the windows peeked out like wary eyes from a face too wise for its years. It was here that Julia, a sophomore with an interest in paranormal psychology, decided to move in, attracted by the house's charm and its eerie reputation. The residence was shared by 6 students, but the room on the attic floor was vacant and somewhat isolated from the rest. It was rumored among the students that whoever stayed in that room didn't last a semester. Complaints of whispers in the night, shadows flitting through the corners of vision, and an oppressive feeling of being watched were common. But Julia, with her curious and brave disposition, dismissed these stories as products of overactive imaginations fueled by the house's Gothic architecture. Upon moving in, Julia was welcomed by her other housemates with mixed expressions of curiosity and pity. Clearly, the rumors had made their rounds. That night, as Julia unpacked her belongings in her room, the attic felt unusually cold. She attributed it to poor insulation and wrapped herself in a sweater before continuing to unpack. Later, as she arranged her books, Julia found a small, dusty journal wedged behind the radiator. It was bound in worn leather, with no name or indication of its owner. Intrigued, Julia thumbed through the pages. The entries were written in a hurried scrawl, filled with ramblings about their eyes in the walls and whispers from below. The last entry ended abruptly, with a smear of ink trailing off the page. That night, as Julia lay in bed, the silence of the house settled around her like a thick blanket. Just as she was drifting to sleep, she heard it, a low, indistinct whisper coming from the direction of the closet. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she sat up, straining her ears against the quiet. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if carrying a desperate message she couldn't quite understand. Summoning her courage, Julia climbed out of bed and walked towards the closet. The floorboards creaked under her weight, breaking the eerie chorus of whispers momentarily. She flung open the closet doors. The space was empty except for the long shadows cast by her bedside lamp. Just as she was about to dismiss her fears as the remnants of a waking dream, she saw it, a quick, dotting shadow, slipping through the wall into the next room. The following days were marked by escalating disturbances. Objects in Julia's room would be found rearranged. Her notes on paranormal phenomena were frequently misplaced, only to turn up in odd locations like the bathroom or the kitchen. The whispers became a constant background noise, growing so customary that Julia caught herself listening for them in moments of silence. Determined to uncover the truth, Julia started researching the history of Whitmore residence. She learned that the house was originally owned by a reclusive professor of anthropology, who was rumored to have conducted strange and unethical experiments involving human psychology and the supernatural. His research was said to have driven him mad, and one day, he vanished without a trace, leaving the house abandoned for years. Fueled by her findings, Julia decided to conduct her own experiment. She set up audio recorders in various parts of her room and around the house, hoping to capture evidence of the phenomena. As night deepened, the atmosphere in the house grew tenser, the shadows in the corners seeming to pulsate with unseen energy. As Julia reviewed the recordings, her headphones filled with the static of white noise, she suddenly froze. A voice, clear and unmistakable, spoke through the static, saying, "They watched from the walls, they whisper truth." The temperature in the room dropped, her breath visible in the air as she turned around slowly. Standing in the middle of her room was a figure, cloaked in shadows, its eyes reflecting a faint, unnatural light. Julia's heart raced as the figure moved closer, the floorboards not making a sound under its weight. "I know you hear us," it spoke, the voice a chilling echo of the whispers she had become so familiar with. "You seek the truth, as he did. But are you ready to face it?" Before Julia could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house, coming from downstairs in the living room. The figure before her vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving a cold void in its wake. Julia, heart pounding with fear and curiosity, grabbed her flashlight and headed towards the source of the sound. What she found in the living room would only deepen the mystery and push her further into the dark history of Whitmore residence. Her roommates were gathered, looking terrified, around the old fireplace where the portrait of the professor had been hung. The portrait, once secured to the wall, now lay on the floor, its frame cracked, the glass shattered. The eyes of the professor in the painting seemed almost alive, his gaze unsettlingly fixated on whoever looked his way. "Did any of you see what happened here?" Julia asked, her voice a mix of fear and command. "No, it just fell." "As if someone or something pushed it," replied Mark, a junior majoring in history, his face pale under the flickering lights of the living room. The group was silent, the only sound the crackling of the old wood in the fireplace. Julia bent down to examine the portrait more closely. As she did, she noticed a small envelope tucked behind the painting. With hesitant fingers, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a faded photograph and a letter, the handwriting matching the frantic scrawl in the journal she had found. The letter was dated 1962, written by the professor himself. It spoke of a doorway he believed he had opened with his experiments, a gateway to what he called the plane of the Watchers. He wrote of his intent to close this door but feared that his efforts might be too late. As Julia read the letter aloud, the temperature in the room dropped, their breaths visible in the air. The whispers started again, this time louder, a chorus of disjointed voices that filled the room with a cacophonous symphony. "We must return the portrait to the wall." "It might be acting as a seal," Julia suggested, her voice barely above the din. With collective effort, they rehung the portrait, the eyes of the professor watching them intently. The moment the painting touched the wall, the air stilled, the whispers falling silent. Feeling a momentary peace, the roommates decided to stay together in the living room for the night, uneasy about returning to their own rooms. They set up sleeping bags and lit candles, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows against the walls. As they settled down, Julia kept replaying the events in her mind. The discovery of the journal, the whispers, the shadows, and now the letter, it all pointed to something far more sinister and profound than mere haunted tales. Unable to sleep, Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Their house groaned softly, as if in pain, the wind outside mimicking the whispers that had plagued them. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the attic, Julia's room. Before she could react, another sound followed, this time from the basement. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to their discoveries and actions. "Did you guys hear that?" whispered Sarah, a freshman who had embraced Julia's interest in the paranormal. "Yes, it's coming from all over the house," Julia whispered back, her voice tense. They all sat up, listening as the thuds continued, a pattern emerging as if something, or someone, was moving through the house, searching. "We need to check this out. We can't just stay here waiting for whatever it is to come to us," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight. Armed with lights and a shared sense of trepidation, they split into two groups. Julia, Mark, and Sarah headed towards the attic while the rest went down to investigate the basement. As Julia ascended the stairs to the attic, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Each step seemed to echo through the house, as if announcing their approach to whatever waited above. Reaching the door to her room, Julia paused, her hand on the doorknob, the whispers echoing in her mind. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was bathed in moonlight, the window left open, the curtains billowing like ghosts in the breeze. Stepping inside, they scanned the room with their flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed as Julia had left it, yet the atmosphere was charged, the shadows seeming to watch them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. The flashlight beams flickered and then went out, leaving them in pitch blackness. "Guys?" Julia's voice trembled as she tried the flashlight. Before anyone could answer, a soft, horrifying giggle filled the room, the sound coming from all around them. The temperature dropped, breaths turning to mist, as the giggle grew into laughter, chilling and mad. As they stood frozen in terror, the laughter abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. Then, out of the darkness, a voice whispered, chillingly close, "You found the doorway. Now, let us show you what lies beyond." The floor beneath them began to vibrate, a low rumble that grew in intensity. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air thickened, as if charged with electricity. Julia felt a hand grasp hers in the dark, squeezing tightly in fear. They were no longer just witnesses to the hauntings of an old house, they were participants in a terrifying reality that the professor had inadvertently invited into the world. As the rumbling intensified, Julia's mind raced. The whispers, the laughter, the sudden cold, every event seemed to be a piece of a sinister puzzle that was far from complete. "Who are you? What do you want?" Julia shouted into the darkness, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. The only response was a sudden shift in the air, as if the darkness itself were alive, breathing and seething with an unseen anger. Then the voice returned, ethereal and omnipresent, chilling them to their core. "We are the Watchers, the ones he called forth from the shadows. We have lingered in the thresholds, and now you have given us a voice, a presence," it whispered, the sound swirling around them like a harsh wind. Julia felt the grip on her hand tighten further, the fear palpable among her friends. "We didn't mean to," she started, but was cut off by a sudden shriek that echoed from the walls, a sound so piercing that they all clapped their hands over their ears. As the echo of the shriek faded, the temperature in the room dropped even further, their breath visible in sharp, frosty puffs. A series of soft clicks resonated around the room, like the ticking of a clock, growing louder and synchronizing into a rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards. Without warning, the flashlights flickered back to life, casting unsteady beams around the room. The light revealed a change in the room's appearance. The walls now bore deep, jagged cracks, as if the very foundation of the house were being split apart by the force of the supernatural presence. From these cracks, a faint, phosphorescent glow emanated, casting an otherworldly light that gave the shadows depth and movement. "Look!" Sarah gasped, pointing towards the corner of the room where the glow was strongest. They all turned to look, and what they saw made their blood run cold. From the crack in the corner, a hand was emerging, pale and translucent like the rest of the apparition they had encountered, its fingers stretching towards them as if desperate to touch the living. Mark stepped back, stumbling over a loose floorboard. "We need to get out of here, now," he exclaimed, panic edging his voice. But before they could move, the floor beneath them began to undulate, the boards warping and groaning under an unseen force. The room felt alive, hostile, as if it were consciously trying to trap them inside. "We can't leave," Julia said, her voice steady despite the terror. "We need to close the door," the professor opened. "It's the only way to stop this." "How?" Sarah's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the groaning of the house. Julia glanced around, her eyes settling on the journal she had found, now lying open on the floor where it had fallen during their initial entrance. She remembered the words of the professor, his theories about the door and how it might be closed. If there was an answer, it would be in there. "We need to find a way to reverse the professor's ritual," Julia said, moving to pick up the journal. As she flipped through the pages, the whispers started again, this time louder, more aggressive, as if trying to drown out her thoughts. The room shook violently, a convulsion that sent them all to the ground. The cracks in the walls widened, the eerie glow intensifying, casting long, twisted shadows that played across the room like dark fire. From the depths of the house, other sounds began to emerge, cries of despair, shrieks of pain, the echoes of past horrors that had been witnessed within these walls. It was as if the house itself was reliving every moment of suffering it had endured since the door had been opened. Julia read aloud from the journal, her voice firm, trying to make sense of the professor's notes under the cacophony of supernatural chaos. He mentioned a counter ritual, something about aligning the house's energy nodes and reciting a binding chant. But where are these nodes? Mark asked, looking around as if the answer might be written on the walls. As if in response, the phosphorescent glow in the cracks pulsed, drawing their eyes to several points around the room. Julia realized these were the nodes the professor had mentioned. They had to act quickly, whatever the cost. "We need to perform the ritual, now," Julia declared, her decision firm despite the uncertainty that gripped her heart. She handed sections of the journal to Mark and Sarah, each taking a position by one of the glowing cracks. As they prepared to recite the binding chant, the air grew thick, the darkness deepening, the house seeming to brace itself for a final, terrifying confrontation. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, the shadows swirling around the trio as they positioned themselves around the glowing nodes. The whispers turned into howls, and the temperature dropped so drastically that their breath turned to mist, hanging in the freezing air like spectral messages. Julia started chanting the words from the journal, her voice clear and resonant in the oppressive atmosphere. Mark and Sarah joined in, their voices uniting in a desperate plea for containment. The words felt powerful, ancient, vibrating in the air with a tangible energy that seemed to resonate with the very walls of the house. As they chanted, the glowing cracks began to pulsate more rapidly, the light growing in intensity until it was nearly blinding. The floor beneath them vibrated, and the walls seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding like the chest of a giant beast. The cries and howls merged into a cacophonous din that threatened to overwhelm their senses. Suddenly, from the largest crack in the corner of the room, a figure began to emerge, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to be made of the same phosphorescent light as the cracks themselves. It was taller than any human, its shape constantly shifting and swirling, a living mass of darkness and light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, burned with a chilling, unnatural glow, fixating on the trio with an intensity that felt almost physical. Julia's heart raced as she continued the chant, her voice growing stronger with each word. The figure advanced, its form becoming more defined, more terrifying. It was as if the darkness of the house had taken on a human-like form, embodying all the fear and horror that the building had absorbed over the decades. The air around them thickened, turning almost solid with the raw power of the ritual. The figure reached out with a hand that was both there and not there, its fingers elongating towards Julia, who stood the closest. She could feel the coldness emanating from it, a cold that seemed to suck the very warmth from her bones. But she did not stop chanting. She could not. The fate of her housemates, the house, and perhaps even their souls depended on completing the ritual. Mark and Sarah's voices wavered as they saw the figure approaching Julia, but she shot them a look that bolstered their courage, and they chanted louder, their words weaving through the air, intertwining with Julia's in a powerful spell of binding. The figure halted, its form shuddering as if struck by the words. It let out a scream that was not of this world, a terrible, ear-splitting sound that made the house tremble and the windows rattle. Yet, the trio did not falter, they felt the power of the chant flowing through them, a stream of energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. As they reached the climax of the chant, a sudden silence fell upon the room. The light from the cracks surged upwards, enveloping the figure in a brilliant, blinding glow. The figure's scream turned into a wail of defeat as it struggled against the light, its form dissolving, becoming part of the luminescence that now filled the room. When the light finally receded, the figure was gone. The cracks in the walls remained, but they were no longer glowing. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time since they had begun, the room felt just like a room. Breathing heavily, Julia, Mark, and Sarah collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. They had done it, they had banished the entity, at least for now. But as they caught their breath, the reality of their situation began to dawn on them. They had touched upon forces that were beyond their understanding, tampered with the very fabric of reality. As they sat there, contemplating their next move, the house began to settle, the old wood creaking as if in relief. But the silence that now hung in the air was a heavy one, pregnant with unasked questions. What had they really done? Was the figure truly gone? What would be the consequences of their actions? These questions lingered in their minds as they slowly stood up, looking around the room that had been the epicenter of such unearthly chaos. The journal lay on the floor where Julia had dropped it, its pages now seeming just ordinary paper, but they knew better. They knew that the story was far from over. Their house had secrets yet to unveil, and the night was still young. As they turned to leave the room, a slight movement from the shadows made them pause. The fear returned as they realized that perhaps not all had been banished to the darkness from whence it came. Julia's eyes narrowed as she strained to see through the darkness at the edge of the room. Her pulse quickened, echoing the sudden, chilling silence that draped over them like a suffocating blanket. She could feel the hairs on her arms stand on end, the primal part of her brain screaming that the danger was not over, that the darkness still had secrets to tell. Mark, noticing Julia's fixed gaze, whispered, "What is it?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely above a breath, "but I saw something move." Sarah clutched her flashlight tighter, her other hand reaching out to find marks in the dark, seeking some comfort in the touch. "Should we check it out?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and the residual adrenaline from their recent ordeal. Before Julia could respond, a soft scraping sound echoed from the same corner, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. It was subtle, almost drowned out by the thumping of their hearts, but unmistakably there. "This house, it's not done with us yet," Julia murmured, a mix of dread and resolve settling in her chest. She turned on her flashlight and pointed it towards the corner, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The light trembled in her unsteady hand, the shadows dancing mockingly at the edge of the beam. As the light settled on the corner, they saw it, a small, old doll with one eye missing and the other hanging by a thread. It was seated against the wall, its head tilted to one side as if it were curiously looking at them. It hadn't been there before, of that Julia was certain. Where did that come from? Mark asked, his voice edged with a hint of panic. "I've never seen that before," Sarah added, her words quick and anxious. Julia approached the doll slowly, her flashlight fixed on its grotesque, worn face. As she came closer, the air around her grew colder, her breath now visible in the light of the flashlight. She reached out hesitantly to touch it, but before her fingers could make contact, the doll's remaining eye moved, its gaze fixing on her. She recoiled instantly, stumbling backward into Mark. It looked at me," she stammered, her heart racing with terror. "That's not possible," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. He took a step forward, shining his flashlight directly on the doll. They watched, breath held, but the eye remained still. "See? It's just an old doll. It must have been left here by someone." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "Things like that don't just appear out of nowhere, Mark." "Not here, not tonight," she said, wrapping her arms around herself as if to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. They decided to leave the doll untouched, backing away slowly. As they turned to leave the room, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the faint whisper of wind sounded through the room, like distant voices calling out to them. The trio made their way back to the living room, each step heavy with the weight of uncertainty and fear. They huddled together on the couch, none of them wanting to admit how vulnerable they felt, how shaken they were. "We need to figure out what's really going on in this house," Julia said after a long silence, her mind racing through the possibilities. "The ritual might have stopped the entity, but I think it stirred up other things that were sleeping here." Mark nodded. "We should research more." Maybe there are records or old newspapers that can tell us more about the house, about the professor's experiments. And we should watch out for each other, Sarah added. Whatever is happening here, we're in the middle of it now. We can't just ignore it. They agreed to spend the rest of the night together in the living room, taking turns watching while the others tried to rest. Their house remained quiet, an oppressive sort of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. As Julia took her turn on watch, the clock on the mantel ticking slowly in the heavy silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows in the corners seemed too deep, too still. Their house was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Her eyes drifted to the windows where the curtains fluttered slightly with the breeze. It was then she saw it, a shadow passing quickly past the window, too quick to make out a form, but unmistakably there. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stood up, moving cautiously toward the window to peer out into the night. Outside, the moon cast a pale light over the yard, the trees casting long, gnarled shadows across the grass. Everything seemed peaceful, normal, but the sensation of being watched was stronger now. As she scanned the yard, her eyes caught movement again at the edge of the tree line. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stood just beyond the reach of the moonlight, its form blurred and shifting. Julia's breath caught in her throat. She squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was as if the shadows themselves had taken human shape, watching, waiting. Without taking her eyes off the figure, Julia called softly over her shoulder, "Mark, Sarah, come here. You need to see this." Her two friends joined her at the window, their expressions turning to confusion and then to fear as they followed her gaze. The figure remained perfectly still, as if aware of their scrutiny. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it moved, retreating back into the darkness of the woods, vanishing from sight. "We need to go out there," Julia said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We need answers, and I have a feeling that whatever is watching us knows more than we do." Mark nodded, a determined look settling over his face. "Let's stick together. Whatever this is, we face it as a group." Arming themselves with flashlights and whatever makeshift weapons they could find, they opened the front door, the cool night air greeting them like a warning whisper. The ground crunched under their feet as they approached the tree line, their beams of light cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but the dense thicket of trees and underbrush. As they reached the spot where the figure had stood, Julia paused, scanning the ground. There, half hidden in the undergrowth, was a small, worn book. She picked it up, dusting off the cover, revealing a title that sent shivers down her spine, "Rituals of the Watched." Flipping through the pages, Julia found notes and sketches that mirrored the professor's writings but with more detail, focusing particularly on how to communicate with and control the entities from the shadow plane. Her eyes widened as she realized that this book could hold the key to understanding everything that had happened. "This isn't just about hauntings or a rogue spirit," Julia murmured as she shared her findings. "It's about a doorway that was never fully closed, a connection to another realm that the professor opened and couldn't shut." They knew what they had to do. Armed with the new knowledge, they made their way back to the house, determined to put an end to the hauntings and close the doorway once and for all. Using the book as their guide, they set up in the attic once again, the site where everything had begun. They arranged symbols and candles as described in the book, each movement precise, each word of the incantation uttered with clear intent. As they began the ritual, the house responded. Winds howled as if in protest, the structure groaned, and shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, crowding closer, more tangible than ever. But the trio stood firm, their voices rising above the chaos, melding together in a powerful chant that filled the room, reverberating with the energy of their combined will. Suddenly, a brilliant light erupted from the center of their circle, blinding and pure. It expanded, swallowing the darkness, the shadows, the entire room. Julia, Mark, and Sarah felt themselves lifted off the ground, their bodies weightless, their spirits buoyed by the force of their spell. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light receded, leaving them gasping on the floor, the house silent around them. Cautiously, they stood, looking around. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of peace that none of them had felt since they moved in. They had done it. They had closed the door. Exhausted but elated, they left the attic, the house settling around them like an old friend finally at rest. As the sun rose, casting gentle light through the windows, they knew that their ordeal was over. The shadows had retreated, the watchers were gone, and the house was just a house once more. But the world felt different now, larger and more mysterious. They had touched something ancient and powerful, and though they had restored balance this time, they knew the darkness was never too far away, always watching, always waiting. As they watched the sunrise, they understood that their lives couldn't return to normal, not really. They had seen too much, knew too much. And somewhere, in the depths of the night, the watchers might still lurk, biding their time. And so, with a newfound respect for the shadows, Julia, Mark, and Sarah moved forward, their bond unbreakable, their lives forever changed by the events that had unfolded in the old Whitmore residence. As the days passed, Julia, Mark, and Sarah tried to return to their normal routines, attending classes and meeting up with friends who remained blissfully unaware of the darkness that had brushed so closely against their lives. Yet, each night as they returned to the Whitmore residence, now silent and seemingly at peace, they could not help but feel a watchful presence lingering in the quiet moments, a reminder that some doors, once opened, never fully close. They often gathered in the living room, discussing their experiences, attempting to process the events together. They spoke of the shadows, the rituals, and the inexplicable happenings that had become their shared reality. With each conversation, they grew closer, their bond forged in the fire of shared terror and triumph. They were no longer just housemates, they were survivors, guardians of a secret that bound them together. As Halloween approached, the town buzzed with excitement, decorations adorning every shop and home, preparing for an evening of ghosts and goblins. The students of the local college prepared costumes, eager to forget their studies and indulge in the festive spirit. Yet, for Julia, Mark, and Sarah, the night held a different meaning. They decided to host a small gathering at the Whitmore residence, a way to reclaim the house completely, to fill its rooms with laughter and light rather than the shadows of the past. Friends came dressed in costumes, filling the house with the noise of celebration, unaware of the deeper, more somber undercurrent that ran beneath the festivities. As the night deepened, the house seemed to come alive with the joy of the party, the earlier malevolence a distant memory. But as the clock struck midnight, a chill wind blew through the house, extinguishing candles and sending a shiver through the crowd. The lights flickered, a brief reminder of the house's darker past. Julia, Mark, and Sarah exchanged glances, each sensing the change in the atmosphere. They moved through the house, reassuring their guests, relighting candles, yet their senses remained heightened, attuned to any sign that the peace they had fought for might be unraveling. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the disturbance ceased. The warmth returned, and the party continued, though a few guests whispered of a strange feeling, a momentary dread that had passed as quickly as it had come. As the last guest left and the door closed behind them, Julia, Mark, and Sarah gathered once again in the living room, the remnants of the party around them. "Do you think it will ever be over?" Sarah asked, a trace of fatigue in her voice. "I don't know," Julia replied, staring into the dimly lit room. "But whatever happens, we face it together. We know how to fight it now, how to stand against the darkness." Mark nodded, his expression solemn. "This house is part of us now, and we are part of its history. Whatever shadows linger, we'll keep the light burning. Together." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts, the weight of their experiences heavy on their shoulders. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they rose, began cleaning up the remnants of the party, their movements a dance of familiar routine. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like soft footsteps retreating into the night. The moon cast a gentle glow over the Whitmore residence, its walls standing firm and quiet. Inside, the light of friendship and courage burned brightly, a beacon against any darkness that might dare to return. And so, the Whitmore residence found its peace, watched over by those who had seen its darkest hours and emerged stronger. The shadows might linger, a whisper of the past in the quiet moments, but the light would always return, as long as Julia, Mark, and Sarah kept watch together. In the heart of a small college town, among tales of ghosts and legends, the story of the Whitmore residence and its brave occupants became a whispered legend of its own, a tale of courage, of shadows faced and fought, and of a light that would never be extinguished.